Right, welcome to another Sociology screencast, and what we're going to do in this short video is continue developing your toolkit at key sociological concepts by focusing on this idea of socialization. And this video builds upon the work that we've already carried out on the concept of culture. So if you missed that lesson, if you missed that work, then make sure that you go back and look at the screencasts on culture. And culture, remember, describes the shared way of life of society or a particular group within society, and it's composed of things like shared norms, values, roles and customs. So in the next two screencasts we're going to try to develop your understanding of culture by looking at two fundamental social processes. We're going to look at socialization in this particular video, and then in the next screencast we're going to look at the concept of social control. And as usual, it's really important to use the pause button if I explain things too quickly, and obviously to take lots of notes as we go through this video. So as usual, let's start with the definition. So socialization, we can see here, can be defined as the processes by which individuals are taught, learn, and then internalize the culture of their society. So socialization describes the various ways in which the culture of society is transmitted to its members. In other words, it's about how we learn the norms, values, roles and customs that make up our culture. And for most members of society, this process of cultural transmission that we call socialization begins in the family. For example, it's within the family that we begin to acquire language, that we begin to learn about morals, that we begin to learn about basic rules. And this stage of socialization is often referred to as primary socialization because it's the first stage. The processes of cultural transmission that go on beyond the family are generally called secondary socialization. And this normally is a phase that begins when children start to become a bit more independent, and in most societies this is marked by the beginning of full-time education. So schools are a really important form of secondary socialization. Now in the exam, it's really important to use the correct jargon. So when you're describing the institutions, the places, the groups within which people are socialized, make sure that you try to use this particular term. Okay, these places are called agencies of socialization. So we can describe the family as the primary agency of socialization because this is where that process of cultural transmission begins. And then if we're talking about the role of other institutions, such as schools, we can describe them as secondary agencies of socialization. And then this other term, focal agencies, this just describes the agent of socialization, which at various points in our lives is the dominant influence. So obviously when we're very young, when we're in our infancy, for most people the family is the focal agency. As children get a bit older, perhaps schools become the focal agency. When we're starting out in our careers, work becomes the focal agency of socialization. And a particularly important secondary agency of socialization that we're going to study in lots of detail later on in the course is of course the mass media. You only need to reflect on the amount of your daily life that you probably now spend looking at a screen to grasp the importance of the media as an agency of socialization. Now most socialization happens informally, and it happens without people even really being aware of it. However, sometimes individuals or social groups deliberately set out to change our behaviour, and this is what is called formal socialization. For example, institutions such as the army will use their training to deliberately alter the mindset, the values of the new recruits. Now in the exam, it's not enough to simply say what socialization is. You've also got to be able to describe how it actually happens. And in order to do this, you need an example. And a really good example, I think, is the example of gender roles. So in relation to gender, sociologists have challenged the traditional view that masculinity and femininity are innate categories, that they are boxes that we're born into. Instead, sociologists would argue that gender roles are things that we learn, things that we acquire through a process of socialization. So masculinity and femininity are categories that we grow into rather than categories that we're born into. So very briefly, let's have a look at how this process of gender socialization begins in the family. Okay, firstly we can highlight this process of canalization illustrated by these two images. And canalization describes the ways in which parents channel or direct their children's interests towards appropriate games, appropriate toys, appropriate activities for their gender. We could also look at the way in which language is used to reinforce a certain gender identity. So the use of verbal appellations, the use of language to label children in a way that reinforces what the parents consider to be appropriate gender identification. Think, for example, of the different pet names that are applied to children according to their gender. Another way in which gender socialization might occur within the family is the way in which children imitate or copy their parents and try and act as they do. So adults become important role models for children who copy their behaviour. In addition to talking about the family, an exam question might also ask you to discuss the role of secondary agencies of socialisation. And a good example, I think, to illustrate gender role socialisation would be the power of the mass media. Think, for example, about the representations of men and women that you find in animated Disney films and the ways in which this might impact upon children's conceptions of masculine identity and feminine identity. Okay, to test whether or not you understand the key points of this screencast, I suggest that you press the pause button now and that you reflect on the questions that you can see on the screen. Hopefully, if you're confident about the material, you should be able to answer all of these questions. And in the next screencast, we're going to build upon the work that we've done on culture and socialisation by looking at something which is a really important part of the socialisation process, and that's the idea of social control.